On behalf of the Hawaiʻi Council for the Humanities, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us this afternoon, this beautiful Aloha Friday. And thank you for taking the time to really learn more about Filipino and Filipino American history. This workshop has been years in the making. We've been thinking about this particular type of Filipino history and bringing it to teachers and students across the state. So we've been planning it, and I'm so happy that Dr. Kim Compoc was happy to be our first speaker for this speaker series. And I'm going to introduce Kim now. Dr. Kim Compoc was born in California to Telugu-born dad and Alabama-born mom who met in the Marshall Islands via the U.S. military. Before entering graduate school at UH Manoa, Kim spent 15 years outside the classroom as a health educator, theater artist, and mediator in San Francisco and Maui. Kim's research focuses on U.S. empire in the Philippines and Hawaii, Asian American studies, as well as diasporic Filipinic studies with an emphasis on indigenous, feminist, and queer critique. In her activism, teaching, and scholarship, she is interested in how the story of empire becomes more evident through continued engagement with each other's stories of resistance. When given support, she believes students can take charge of their education and confront those forces that aim to silence them. For educators at public institutions, she believes this is our mandate. Kim is an assistant professor of history at UH West Oahu. Thank you so much, Kim, for your amazing wisdom that you're about to share with us. And I'm so happy that I get to share this space with you. I'm going to turn it to you, Kim. So thank you so much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Shannon. Aloha awi nala, maayong hapon, magandang hapon, naimbag amalim. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm so pleased to be speaking to this esteemed group of teachers and students today. As Shannon said, I'm an assistant professor of history at University of Hawaii West Oahu. And I'd just like to acknowledge that this is a very difficult time with the pandemic and with so much demanding our attention in the world right now. And I just want to communicate my deep respect to all of the teachers who I know have so much to shoulder right now. And yet here you are coming to this talk today. I would like also to acknowledge that we are on occupied land, that this is the ancestral home of the Kanaka Maoli people, and that today is actually a day of mourning for Kanaka Maoli. And so I just stand in solidarity with you, Kanaka Maoli in the room, and the wider community. And I hope that these remarks can be in solidarity with those efforts for self-determination. I'd like to thank Shannon, who's one of our alumni, for inviting me here today, as well as to Liz Soto and Aiko Yamashiro for the words of encouragement as I prepared this talk. Thank you to the Hawaiʻi Council for the Humanities, especially Devin for making the beautiful flyer, and also the other sponsors of this event, Tinalak Filipino Education Advisory Council, University of Hawaii College of Education, Filipino American Historical Society of Hawaii, and the Hawaii Plantation Village. I'm going to share my screen. Before I do, my mouth often gets dry during these kinds of talks, and I have quite a few slides that need to be read. Could I just get 5 people to volunteer for me to get helpers on the reading of the slides? Okay, let me make sure I got the share button happening here. La la la. In case you didn't see the flyer, this is what we're talking about. I think this might be the nicest flyer that I've ever had a talk for, so thank you again, Devin. So the title of my talk is 10 Things You Should Know When Teaching Filipino and Filipino American History in Hawaii. I am beginning with this very famous cartoon by Hawaii's own Corky Trinidad, who wrote this cartoon, who just drew this cartoon in 1981 on the eve of the 75th anniversary of the first Cicadas contract workers who came to Hawaii. And let's see, who do we have who's volunteered? Anjali, can you please read us the first slide?
Do you want me to read the, hi Kim, I love you, thank you for doing this. Do you want me to read the cartoon, or am I reading the quote coming from Corky Trinidad, or both?
Actually, could you read both?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so are you Filipino? Oh no, I'm Chinese, Spanish, Portuguese, Irish, Welsh, Mexican, Dutch, Scottish, Korean, Japanese, Hawaiian. But my parents are. And this quote coming from Corky Trinidad: in the 37 years that I have lived in Hawaii, I have seen friends change their names or the pronunciation of their names to make them sound more Haole, or at least more continental. They have added more blood to their lines, thinking it would make them a better class of Filipinos. Corky Trinidad, 1939 to 2009.
Yeah, so I think we can debate after my talk how relevant Trinidad's words are with today's generation of youth. In the 19 years that I have lived in Hawaii, I have seen a noticeable shift from this attitude. Indeed, the research that I do about decolonized Filipinics in Hawaii and the connection to the Hawaiian sovereignty movement is made possible by the many scholar activists and young people who I work with and whose voices I want to amplify, essentially telling a new story of Filipinos in Hawaii. We only have 90 minutes today, so I'm not as interested in giving you a comprehensive list of historical facts to memorize or a linear, neat timeline with a set of elite male heroes, but rather a set of tools to equip you and hopefully inspire you to learn more on your own. So a key word for this talk today is opportunity, as in Filipino history offers us a great opportunity to talk about many different things. Put differently, I won't be giving you Noah's Ark, but rather the 10 Commandments. Filipino Catholics in the room are laughing at my Catholic hangover. But making jokes in light of serious issues is another time-honored Filipino cultural tradition, because the truth is Filipino history can be really disturbing to read. At the same time, it offers us the opportunity to talk about resistance and the important lessons that our ancestors and other keepers of Filipino genius have imparted to us. Before I begin, I'd like to bring some important people into the room. This is a picture of my grandparents, my Lola and my Lolo, along with my cousins and me. That's me in the red here. Circa 1978. As Shannon pointed out, I did not grow up in Hawaii, but my father was. He was born and raised in Kahuku. And when I was 8, he sent me on a plane to learn all about Hawaii and how he grew up. My mother is from a white military family in Huntsville, Alabama, and he knew I was getting a big earful of the white American way of doing things. Having left Hawaii for the military and then college, he insisted that I learn the sights and sounds of life in Hawaii, the wisdom of local culture, the beauty of Filipino accents, the taste of the food. My father impressed on me what it felt like to grow up on a plantation, the son of immigrants, of underpaid agricultural workers who had to send their children to public schools, the Americanized public schools, where there would be almost no information about Filipino culture or history, and certainly not resistance history, even though Filipino students made up a sizable portion of the student body. Indeed, my father understood, as did I, what Ngugi wa Thiong'o meant when he described his experience growing up in British-occupied Kenya, as the colonial school system there treated his history, the history of the Kikuyu people, as one wasteland of non-achievement. It is this injustice that also motivates my work in teaching Filipino history today. I'd also like to bring these 3 intellectual ancestors into the room. Don Boholano Mabalon was a California-based scholar of Filipino American history. This book on the left, Little Manila is in the Heart, the Making of the Filipino American Community in Stockton, California, is a hugely important text in the field. She died 3 years ago this month while on vacation on Kauai. Lilia Quindosa Santiago died earlier this year in the Philippines. She was a poet and a literary scholar and author of this important book, Sexuality and the Filipina. She was also my Ilocano instructor at UH Manoa and also a voice of conscience against the Marcos dictatorship. Lastly, Virgilio Menor Felipe, the historian and playwright, who published this book, Hawaii, A Filipino Dream, the play 1898, as well as an unpublished volume on Filipino history, who was also one of the early advocates for ethnic studies at UC Berkeley and Operation Monong at UH Manoa. When I lived on Maui, I invited him to speak on Filipino history to a group of community service workers. That's how I met and connected with him. He unfortunately died earlier this month in the Philippines. All of these are really distinct scholars whose work needs to be remembered and amplified. Please, 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 this lecture is free, but if you have the money, please support Filipino historians so we can keep our books in print. So October, before I get into the substance of the talk, I just want to acknowledge that it might be difficult to do everything that I'm asking those of you who are teachers in the public schools. And so I have in mind, if you can do nothing else, but show a 7-minute video in October for Filipino American History Month, please do that. And so I'd like to start with just the 7-minute video that I think that the Filipino American National Historical Society did. I think it actually does a pretty decent job. And I'd like to go ahead and begin with that before I get into my talk. Okay. We all together now? Again, not perfect, but not bad for 7 minutes. Not bad. I think that might be, a really easy way to share some information when October comes around. I really love that we're doing this series though, and kind of decentering October. It's really, we should be able to talk about Filipino history whenever we want. And so thank you for making sure that we're reminded of that, Shannon and the folks at Hawaiʻi Council for the Humanities. All right, back to my slideshow here. So yeah, at a minimum, there you have that YouTube video. On the other side here, Pinoy Educational Partnerships, I actually think this is one of the better and more complete, more thorough, and more teacher-friendly resources that I'd like to offer folks. If you can, talk your library into ordering one thing, it's not as strong. It's focused on the continent, but I think that this is an incredible resource, which is also on the list that I put onto the Padlet. So let's talk about this place called the Philippines. So this is a map of the archipelago that we know today as the Philippines, often described in 3 main regions. Here, Luzon, where Ilocanos are, and Tagalogs, on this Visayan region here, and Mindanao here in the south. If you're curious, my grandparents are from here, Bohol. Around 7,000 islands in total. Only 2,000, however, are inhabited, about 108 million people. There are over 170 languages. The official language is Filipino, a derivative of Tagalog. The second most popular is Cebuano or Visayan, and also Ilocano, which is the most prominent spoken in Hawaii. And you can see also on this key on the right, Bicol, Kapampangan, Pangasinan, Waray. There's many other languages in the Philippines. And if you know any Filipinos who have quote unquote a Filipino accent, it's often you'll find that it's not that English is their second language, it's that English is their third or their fourth or even their fifth language, because the Philippines is a multilingual society that has incredible intellectual muscle for learning new languages all the time. Zooming out now, just want to situate where the Philippines is in Southeast Asia. We have our neighbors, China and Taiwan to the north, Vietnam to the west, Malaysia and Indonesia here to the south, Palau and Guahan to the east. Some people like to ask, are Filipinos Asian or are Pacific Islanders? You can see the map, they're kind of in the border between the two, with Micronesia, Melanesia, Australia, and then further out, Hawaii and the Polynesian Triangle. My apologies, I know that these are colonial terms, not indigenous ones. We Filipinos were named after King Felipe of Spain in 1565. So we know the discomfort of being named from the outside very well. We may identify as islanders, but usually it's as Philippine Islanders, not necessarily included in the category of Pacific Islanders, although as you can see, again, we're right on the corner. And that brings me to the first of my 10 lessons here. Filipino history offers a great opportunity for us to talk about global history. So many of us know about Ferdinand Magellan. In fact, there's a street named after him, only walking distance from my house. His name is synonymous with attempts to circumnavigate the globe, leaving from Spain in 1519. Fewer people know that he actually met his end in the Philippines in April 1521. Yes, we just celebrated the 500-year anniversary of the Battle of Mactan. Lapu-Lapu, the infamous swordsman depicted here, was not able to stop the Spanish from colonizing the archipelago, but he was able to delay it, which counts very much indeed. And I recently heard a lecture by the Cebuano historian Recio Mojares, who I had the pleasure of studying with when he was in residence at UH Manoa. And I put his lecture also on the list of resources. And he reminds us that Lapu-Lapu, who sometimes looms large in the Filipino imagination, but often one-dimensionally, should be recognized as a military strategist who had to assess when and how to engage his opponent in order to win this decisive battle. People also think of Filipino history with regard to it being a global history because of the galleon trade. And so if you didn't know, Spain ruled the Philippines through Mexico. And so this is how we have a lot of Chinese goods end up in Spain. The image of the flamenco dancer with a fan that all came through the galleon trade. Silver circulated in the global market because of this. This is not my favorite story of the global Filipino, because obviously this is a colonial geography. A lot of people also think of the Philippines in terms of the Austronesian family of languages, which also tells its own global story. Again, we have what we call the Pacific here on the east, the Philippines here in the middle, but also the Indian Ocean. And so we say salamat, that comes from assalamu alaikum. We have a lot of Arabic words in the in Philippine languages. Our trade and our interactions went all the way westward to Madagascar. And so as we listen to linguists, more and more stories are coming out about our pre-Hispanic connections to other parts of the world. And I would like to quote here from a recent article, Toward a World History of Small Countries, the Philippines as Global Connector. This is by Professor Paul Adams, who said, there's nothing like it anywhere in the world. As it happens, the Philippines is a vital link in the network of interconnected humanity. And anyway, I put that article in the resources as well. Oh, and one last thing on the whole point of being global, in the contemporary reality is that Filipinos are now in over 100 nations throughout the world, usually as overseas contract workers, which is, not necessarily a happy thing, but definitely a reminder that Filipinos exist in the world, not just in the Philippines, not just in the United States, but in many countries throughout the world today. So, number two, Filipino history offers us a great opportunity to talk both about colonialism, imperialism, empire, but also anti-colonial resistance. And so we have some of the Gabriela Silang, probably the most famous woman warrior in the Philippines, who fought the Spanish in 1763, Jose Rizal, who was a physician and probably the most famous novelist in the Philippines. He wrote Nole Me Tangere, which was he was murdered he was assassinated by the Spanish for seditious acts. We have Apolinario Mabini here, considered the brains of the Philippine Revolution, and Andres Bonifacio, who was really important revolutionary leader. Yes, so here we are. The timeline of the colonizers. I wonder, Kahala, would you mind helping me out with this important slide?
Yeah. In 1521, Lapu-Lapu defeats Ferdinand Magellan in the Battle of Mactan. In 65, the arrival of Spanish Miguel Lopez de Legazpi and Spanish occupation begins. From 1762 to 1764, the British occupation of the Philippines. 1896, the Philippine Revolution against the Spanish. In 98, you have the Spanish-American War, the Spanish occupation ends, and Filipinos declare independence. In 1899 to 1902 and 1913, you have the Filipino American War, independence is aborted, and the US occupation begins. In 1934, the Tidings-McDuffie Act, also called the Philippine Commonwealth and Independence Act, is passed. In 1941 to 1945, you have Japanese occupation and Manila is destroyed. And in 46, independence with strings, military bases, free trade, and neocolonialism.
Thank you. So much to say about this, but I just want to say what should be obvious to everybody, but to be colonized once is a trauma. To be colonized twice is a double trauma. To be colonized 3 times is a triple trauma. And the fact that we're in 500 years of foreign contact with the Philippines just kind of gives you a sense of the weight of what it means to have foreign rule. People from, and we know this in Hawaii, but I think in the Filipino example, it's even longer and even more bloody in terms of the greed of Europe coming to pillage and what it means to have to answer to rulers from an ocean and a continent away. Now, a lot of times, what the Spanish did to the Philippines is more accessible to a lot of Filipino Americans. The fact that we can even say Filipino American War is a fairly recent phenomenon in American public schools or in the American media. Indeed, like people like me who consider themselves Filipino Americanists, a lot of what we've been doing, I think, is trying to unpack the legacy of this violent genocidal war. And it is a very complicated history to unpack, but I think that when we talk about Filipinos and why, a lot of times people begin with identity crisis, yeah? And like trying to understand how to articulate yourself in the world, how to assert your culture in the world. I think so much of it, we theorize about this moment, the fact of the war, the brutality of the war, and the fact that it has remained so silent. That it, like a lot of times the people want to refer to it as an insurrection instead of a proper war. And so anyway, I could go on and on. Don't let me go on and on. There's so much wisdom in the room and I want to be able to have a conversation. But trigger warning, there are some images. Actually, this one they covered in the video, but I just wanted to say it one more time. General Jacob Smith in the Battle of Samar famously said, "Kill everyone over 10." The American press, picked this up, and this was, something that the Americans had to answer to what exactly is happening in the Philippines. Also, when we talk about the water cure, this became an important conversation, recently in the contemporary wars in the Middle East. Some people know, or maybe not, that this was inaugurated, this practice of torture was inaugurated in the Philippines right about the same time that war photography sort of becomes a thing. And this grainy snapshot reportedly taken in Pangasinan province in May 1901, maybe the most authentic evidence of the administration of the water cure. Where my family's from in Bohol, this was along with village burnings and concentration camps and the burning of schools. This was one of the things that we have ample evidence for. So we know that 4,200 Americans died in the US wars in the Philippines, but how many Filipinos died? And this is, again, a really painful thing to talk about, because as we look at the different historians who try to put a number on this, you can see that there is wide diversity. Was it 100,000? Was it 2 million? How much was because of combat? How much was because of starvation and cholera? Just by way of comparison, in the Civil War, 618,000 people died. So again, when we talk about entering the Filipino history classroom, this can be, I think, a real challenge for teachers. How do you talk about traumatizing kind of information? I think that there's been some confusion sometimes, like the word colonialism. Sometimes people can kind of soft pedal on what that means. In the case of the Philippines, I think it's really important to foreground, what we're really talking about with regard to mass killings. And so for those of you who are familiar with, the 1800s and genocidal frontier homicide of Native Americans, a lot of those generals, replicated those same genocidal tactics in the Philippines. So we're here in Hawaii, though. Let's talk a little bit about some Hawaiian and Filipino connections. Liliuokalani was the last reigning monarch who was overthrown in 1893 by the U.S. sugar planter interests in Hawaii. President Aguinaldo was president the first president of the Philippines. And I think it's interesting thinking about them as contemporaries and what the annexations of 1898 also affected Hawaii, what this meant both for both of these important leaders. Devin, if you wouldn't mind reading both of these.
Right. The first one, I declare such a treaty, U.S. Treaty of Annexation, to be an act of wrong toward the native and part native people of Hawaii, an invasion of the rights of the ruling chiefs in violation of international rights, both toward my people and toward friendly nations with whom they have made treaties. The perpetuation of the fraud whereby the constitutional government was overthrown, and finally, an act of gross injustice to me. Queen Liliuokalani of Hawaii, 1897. The second, I solemnly protest in the name of God, the root and the fountain of all justice and of all right, and who has given to me the power to direct my dear brothers in the difficulty against this intrusion of the government of the United States in the sovereignty of these islands. President Emilio Aguinaldo of the Philippines, 1899.
Thank you so much. I'd like to end this section with a positive note. Jose Sabas de Borneo, was known as Manila Man, was a contemporary of Liliuokalani. He lived here in Honolulu, and he was the head of the Royal Hawaiian Band at the time of the overthrow. And he refused to take the loyalty oath that was demanded by the Americans. And instead, he composed the music for a really important song of sovereignty called Ananapua in solidarity with Liliuokalani. And he toured with the Royal Hawaiian Band across the US, singing all the way from San Francisco all the way to Boston. And I think for a lot of us in Hawaii who are critical of US occupation, whether it's the Philippines, or Hawaii or wherever in the world, we really see him as kind of a decolonial ancestor. And so it's one of my dreams to go to Peru someday and to look at the Peruvian archive of him, because he, after his money ran out, he ended up in Peru, and he's actually a beloved composer for the Peruvian struggle as well. So really interesting historical figure. So number 3, Filipino history offers a great opportunity to talk about education. So this is Renato Constantino, and he wrote an essay, probably one of the most famous essays in English by a Filipino, Renato Constantino. Actually, Anjali, would you mind reading this one, please?
Sure. Okay, so this is the miseducation of the Filipino. The American military authorities had a job to do. They had to employ all means to pacify a people whose hopes for independence were being frustrated by the presence of another conqueror. The primary reason for the rapid intrusion on a large scale of the American public school system in the Philippines was the conviction of the military leaders that no measure could so quickly promote the pacification of the island as education.
Ooh, so I think, building on the previous slide, I think a lot of Hawaiians can identify with this, the idea that the education system is, not teaching people critical thinking, but instead teaching them to obey. And for those of you who love literature, this is a really important text by a Filipino gay writer who talks about this very issue. Like, what exactly does it feel like to be a Filipino in the public schools today? And so I don't have a section of that. We're going to run out of time if we divert to Landmark. But a big part of what he's arguing with the book is that the American the school system is a part of the U.S. colonial legacy, stretching from the Philippines and into Hawaii both. So number 4, Filipino history offers us a great opportunity to talk about race as a social construction. not biological. And I think that this is important. As we think, this is a picture of McKinley. Many of us are raised, oh, excuse me, this is a picture of McKinley, who we have a high school named after, who was president, who's key figure in the annexation of not just Hawaii, but also the Philippines, Guam, Cuba, and Puerto Rico at the close of the Spanish-American War. And this image here of the Philippines as like an unruly child that has to be cleaned, that has to be educated. This was really effective technique, especially when you think about the United States where literacy was not widespread. And so images held a lot of power in the press. And so this book here, The Forbidden Book, is kind of one, a real breakthrough in exposing this legacy of these deeply racist cartoons. And this is one that's also included. School Begins. This is an incredibly famous image as well. And as you can see, the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba are figured here in the front as the darkest people in the room, save this figure over here on the left. There's a Native American here who's reading upside down. And then we have Texas and California as like these white figured as these white students who presumably are placated and know how to behave. There's a Chinese person or Chinese student here who's not being admitted. Remember, this is still Chinese Exclusion Act. And so you can imagine just how derogatory, how insulting it was for Filipino revolutionaries to be depicted in this manner, and for Filipino immigrants who came to the United States ostensibly because the war was ravaging their communities, to see that all this talk of America as this land of the free and everything is really a sham. I think the other part that is useful to remember is the way that race intersects with Islamophobia. It's often that Filipinos are depicted as kind of like a Black person, kind of like a Native American person, kind of like a Muslim, and it's all this kind of weird racial anxiety that the US is projecting onto Filipinos to justify colonization. And of course, as Edward Said reminds us, as the colonizer projecting onto you what you are, I'm also making an argument about race, of who the Anglo-Saxon race is, and this notion that white people are meant to dominate the earth, and that what's actually happening here isn't genocide, but this is a benevolent assimilation, and that this is for their own good. Actually, the poem White Man's Burden is written by Rudyard Kipling. He's actually talking about the Philippines. And so again, this like Anglo-American cooperation to quell the darker races and to pacify them and to justify land theft, and which is an ongoing problem. So number 6, Filipino history offers us a great opportunity to talk about indigeneity and land protection. And so we've talked a little bit about the Hawaiian struggle. Of course, we have most recently, and probably the most important struggle to enter the international press, the most important Hawaiian struggle to enter kind of the international imagination, the protection of Mauna Kea. And here we have a bunch of decolonial Filipinx folks making sure that we are, again, telling a new story of where our loyalties lie, and thinking about Kanaka Maoli and how they articulate their relationship to land as the first peoples of Hawaii. And what does that mean for us as we think about the first peoples of the Philippines? And I wanted to just give a little shout out. If you're looking for free resources, the Little Brown podcast, I think, is just awesome. This is a podcast about the uncomfortable past and precarious presence of the indigenous peoples. The Little Brown podcast is about head takers, white burdens, and expensive G-strings. If you haven't had the chance, this is an amazing podcast of diasporic Igorot folks. For those of you who don't know, the Igorot, like Black, like Filipino, like Polynesian, this is another term that some people find offensive. It's a colonial term, but it's also proved kind of useful for some people. And so Little Brown Podcast is reminding us this is not the Igorot experience, this is our Igorot experience. Another term that you might hear, this is where, this is the ancestral homeland that they're referring to here in the Cordilleras and Luzon. And some people prefer, you know, to assert not a regional identity or what's a complicated colonial identity, but Ifugao or Apayao, Kalinga, etc. Number 6, Filipino history offers a great opportunity to talk about language and accent diversity. And I just wanted to offer this like, you know, anecdote. When I was in graduate school, I had a person who was in the janitorial staff of Kaikendall, who is absolutely in the category that I mentioned before, who was, you know, she spoke the language of her village. She also spoke Tagalog because of the school system. She spoke Ilocano because she married one, and then she spoke Arabic because she went to Saudi Arabia. And I was there in the English department thinking to myself, why is this person, changing, you know, emptying my rubbish can? Well, clearly this is a person with incredible intellectual skills that she could be multilingual at this level. And it just goes to, you know, it's such a reminder too, that when we hear someone's accent, that this is proof of their multilingual capability. I also wanted to give a shout out to Mari Matsuda, who is a professor in the UH Law School. Critical race theory has been getting a lot of attention in the press recently, and she is kind of credited with being one of the early thinkers on why that is important, understanding the role of white supremacy in the in the legal tradition of the United States. And this essay, Voices of America, Accent, Anti-Discrimination Law, and a Jurisprudence for the Last Reconstruction, is such a beautifully written essay. It's 1991. It's a little bit outdated by it's very multicultural, kind of in a, you know, very like kind of what I like about America kind of essay, but it does a beautiful job thinking about what an accent says about a person. And this, even this opening paragraph. Who's next? Is it Devin? Are you next? Oh, sorry, hold on, one back one. Go ahead.
All right. Introduction. Every person who reads this article has an accent. Your accent carries the story of who you are, who first held you and talked to you when you were a child, where you lived, your age, the schools you attended, the languages you know, your ethnicity, whom you admire, your loyalties, your profession, your class position. Traces of your life and identity are woven into your pronunciation, your phrasing, your choice of words. Yourself is inseparable from your accent. Someone who tells you they don't like the way you speak is quite likely telling you that they don't like you.
It's really, really amazing article. And she actually spends quite a bit of time on the case of Manuel Fragrante, who was a Filipino in Hawaii who sued the DMV for accent discrimination. He lost, but the way that she tells the story, I think, is really fascinating, because the DMV insisted that his accent was so thick that people couldn't understand him, even though when you look at the transcript of the person who was typing, what do you call that, the stenographer, like she was able to follow him word for word, never had to ask him to repeat. And he also got like the top score of the the civil service exam. And so it's, I think, a really important reminder about the way that anti-Filipino racism works is so often through accent discrimination. And I think this legacy is still with us. Wanted to give a shout out to Jonathan Okamura, who talks about this a lot in his chapter in ethnicity and inequality in Hawaii, and also Roderick Labrador in Building Filipino Hawaii, and thinking about Filipino accents as like a dividing line between the born here and born there, and that this is really a place that we need to do better thinking about, especially in our public schools. Number 7, Filipino history offers us a great opportunity to talk about gender and sexual diversity. Shout out to Grace Nono, who is ethnic what do you call it, ethnomusicologist. And she wrote this important book, Babaylan Sing Back. Babaylan are Philippine shamans. In the pre-Hispanic era, Babaylan were considered, the enemy of the Spanish priests, but they are not just historical figures. They also have a presence in contemporary Philippines, and she does a great job reminding us of that. Also, just for those of you interested in kind of military history, once again, we have here Gabriela Silang, the Ilocano independence leader, with a knife, 1763. And then more in the World War II era, Valeria Yay Pandilio, she wrote an autobiography about her role as a guerrilla in the World War II era. She was also a mixed heritage person. So yeah, telling a new story of mestizas or hapas that are proudly Filipino. Also, this is, if you're looking for documentaries that are free, this one on the left, Walang Rape sa Bontok, this is an amazing documentary you can get on YouTube that looks at basically this assumption that we have that rape culture is global. The notion that all men are a part of this patriarchal culture, like again, like this notion of the biological. And they interview indigenous folks in the Bontoc area and Cordilleras who did not have a word for rape. And these are like two women from Manila who go there to unpack this really important lesson around gender relations in the Philippines. And this one on the right is not free. Kalhor Ganda came out a couple of years ago. Really beautiful documentary about Jennifer Laude and the transnational movements to win justice for her. She was murdered by a transphobic U.S. Marine. This film, I think, does a really good job of talking about what neocolonialism looks like with regard to the women around the bases and the intersection between, movements for LGBT rights, but also movements for Philippine sovereignty. And then also shameless shout out for an event coming up in October. I'm going to be interviewing Professor Bernadette Gonzalez, who's been a really important mentor to me on her fabulous new book, Empire's Mistress, starring Isabel Rosario Cooper. For those of you who are World War II historians, you might remember that Isabel Rosario Cooper has been kind of remembered as only the mistress of MacArthur, but Professor Gonzalez tells a much more interesting story and puts her into the driver's seat. She says, this is not a love story. So I hope you guys can attend that. And this is also an important reminder. Filipino history offers a great opportunity to talk about labor organizing. Melinda Kirkle's brilliant book, Pablo Manlapi, a Filipino labor leader in Hawaii. This was, I think, a really great example of a really smart transnational kind of history. In case you don't know, Pablo Manlapi was a labor organizer and a lawyer. He was perhaps one of the most important Filipino labor organizers in the 1930s. He sadly was deported. His legacy lives on. America is in the Heart is probably the most famous Filipino American book. I hope you don't mind, Shannon, I'm going to quote you. She said that this was absolutely one of the most pivotal experiences of her college education, reading this book at UH West Oahu, and kind of pivoting her away from British literature to realize that Filipinos have literature too. And the Bulosan Center at UC Davis was actually named after Carlos Bulosan. He didn't only write this, he was also an essayist and poet, and so but I would include that. And then of course, Filipino organizing is not just about men, but this important book on the right, Catherine Choi's Empire of Care. If you've ever wondered why there's so many Filipino nurses, this book really explains the legacy of this particular kind of brain drain of Filipino nurses coming to the United States after being trained by the Americans, and what that has meant, and what that says, especially for a country that needs as many of its own, that has healthcare crises of its own. And then as far as labor, I had to include this important reminder that the Lanai strike of 1951 was led by Filipinos. Shout out to Dean Serenilio and this important book, Unsustainable Empire, Alternative Histories of Hawaii Statehood. He actually ends his book with this story. Actually, Kahala, do you mind helping me out?
I just wanted to read the timeline.
Yeah, if you don't mind.
1947 Pineapple Strike, which lasted only 5 days. In 51, Filipino workers on the Na'i organized a wildcat strike. The ILWU, Jack Hall, tries to negotiate after 30 days, and workers organized 3 committees on fishing, hunting, and planting. The strike lasts how long?
All right. A quiz worth 0 points. Please put into the chat. How many days did the strike last? Does anybody know? Take a wild guess, it's okay. No points, no prizes. No, let's guess. Let's guess. 270. Aiko, you're showing off. I was amazed by this statistic. Yeah, to just say it again, Jack Hall, who was like, considered, this, brilliant union organizer or whatever, he tried to negotiate. After 30 days, they were ready to give up. 30 days are ready to give up. And the workers, Filipino workers who had these kind of skills, who can fish, who can hunt, who can plant. Yeah, and with those, Aina-based literacies, the strike was able to last for 201 days. Just an extraordinary feat, extraordinary feat. You could smell the unharvested and rotting pineapple from the west side of Maui. I just love this story so much. And ultimately, the Lanai strike managed to gain a 15-cent increase, 3 cents higher than their original demand, and secured industry-wide bargaining with all the pineapple workers receiving the same benefits as the Lanai strikers. The strike is sometimes referred to as a happy strike. Workers were not living according to capitalist time and had, in fact, built a large bamboo structure where more than 300 were able to community share their meals. And he makes the argument that this kind of knowledge is what we really need as we try to stand up to the capitalist notions of scarcity that say that we are headed toward disaster that we that we're helpless to do anything about with regard to climate change, et cetera. And so what we have brilliant people in our communities that we can listen to, not just who we refer to as the job creators, but the people who really know how to help us survive. Yes, and speaking of people who help us survive, Filipino history offers us a great opportunity to talk about COVID-19. And so in case you didn't know, Filipino nurses make up only 4% of nurses in the United States, but close to a third of those who have died. And I just wanted to acknowledge this website I just found out about this week. Kanungan means shelter or refuge, and they've been collecting data to honor the dead, not just nurses, but other medical staff who sadly are no longer with us, as they've been working so hard to serve everyone who's sick from COVID, this terrible disease. And I would love to just honor just real Laui V. Juan, who sadly is the first UH West Oahu, perhaps the first student in the UH system that we know of at least, who's died from COVID. Are there any Ilocanos in the room who wouldn't mind reading? Rosie, or Mary, if you don't mind, I thought this was really beautiful. The parents shared this Ilocano proverb, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, sorry. I'm not fluent in Ilocano, but let me try this. I'm half Ilocano, half Japanese.
Okay.
This is an Ilocano proverb. Awan kas iti susuro sinikua ta data awan makatakao kenka. Knowledge is wealth that can't be stolen. Tells us that the meaning of life is to find your gift, and the purpose of your gift is to give it away. Jezreel gave his gift of insight, perseverance, and love for family to us all. Pardon the mispronunciation.
No, I'm indebted to you. Thank you. I would try, but you know, I can hear Mona Lilia on the other side telling me that my pronunciation would be totally inadequate. And I just wanted to honor his memory properly. So thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it. And then last, I thought, you know, Filipino history offers us a great opportunity to talk about environmental history and climate justice. And if you don't remember, you know, Typhoon Haiyan, the deaths from that devastating typhoon, I think it's still the most devastating typhoon to ever touch ground, killed over 6,000 people in the Philippines and was devastating in terms of, you know, climate refugees that created. But I don't want to talk about Filipinos only in terms of how they've been victimized by climate change and climate catastrophe. This is a really exciting. Shell, ExxonMobil, Chevron, and BP could be legal and morally liable for climate crisis in the Philippines. I know I've talked a lot about, you know, the crimes of the Americans, but I think it's important to note not just the role of nation states in making life difficult for smaller countries like the Philippines, but the role of multinational corporations like these ones here. And I think it's really exciting that we're trying, not just in the Philippines, but other places around the world that are trying to hold corporations account for the climate catastrophe. And I'd love to end with just this beautiful image here. This is, you know, considered one of the 8 wonders of the world. These are the rice terraces in Manaue. I've never been there, but you know, Filipinos remind us that this is what civilization looks like. This is what a community who can feed itself looks like. This is what mental health might look like if we could live with a proper relationship to land. And I think that there's so much, as I said earlier, there's so much Filipino genius if we can just lean in and listen and understand better. And that's the end of my talk. Mahalo, everybody, for listening.
Thank you so much, Kim. That was awesome. You shared so much information with us. Wow. I learned so much in the last hour. I'm just going to reiterate that I've been adding all of the resources that Kim shared with us on the Padlet, and I put it in the chat, but I'm going to put it in the chat one more time because I've been adding as we've been going. So, and also, if you have anything that you guys also want to share, you can also add it to the Padlet.